Hey guys, tonight we are diving headfirst, eyes wide, pupils possibly wider, into one of the strangest, most misunderstood and frankly most eventful journeys in human history, the complete story of psychedelics. Not the tie-dye poster in your college roommate's dorm kind. Not the guy at a music festival who thinks he's discovered the universe kind. I mean the real story. Ancient, weird, frequently illegal, occasionally sacred, and somehow ending up in a PowerPoint presentation in a San Francisco office building in the 2000s. Before you get comfortable, I want to take a second to genuinely, sincerely thank whoever suggested this topic. You know who you are. You typed it into the comments, probably late at night, probably with the quiet confidence of someone who has thought about this more than once. And honestly, it shaped this entire video. This channel grows because of you, so thank you. If you enjoy what I do here, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment, but only if you actually mean it. No pressure. Soft tap on the like button, that's all I'm asking. And hey, we're now on Spotify too, so if you'd rather drift off listening through there, the link is in the description. Now, dim those lights. Put on a fan if you've got one. That soft white noise is genuinely doing something for us. Pull the blanket up. Get your pillow at exactly the right angle. You know the one. And let's just pause for a second because I have some questions. Have you ever wondered what it felt like to chew a mysterious root in a firelit cave 10,000 years ago and suddenly believe you were communicating with the sun? Did ancient shamans have bad trips? And if so, who do they complain to? How did humanity go from sacred mushroom ceremonies performed in total silence to the CIA, yes, that CIA, secretly dosing unwitting citizens with LSD in hotel rooms? Why did an entire generation of incredibly well-educated scientists decide the answer to human consciousness was a fungus? And how did we end up at a place where a retired hedge fund manager in Marin County is microdosing psilocybin before his Tuesday morning Zoom call and calling it a spiritual practice? These are the questions we're going to answer tonight. So, congratulations. You have just woken up somewhere between a Mesoamerican temple, a 1960s government laboratory, and a very expensive wellness retreat in Joshua Tree. You don't know what you took. You're probably fine. Let's begin. Long before humans had written language, agriculture, or strong opinions about taxes, they had mushrooms. And some of those mushrooms, it turns out, did things. The earliest evidence of psychedelic use doesn't come from a journal article or a pharmaceutical trial. It comes from cave paintings, specifically from rock art discovered in the Sahara Desert in Algeria, dated to somewhere around 9000 BCE, depicting humanoid figures with mushrooms sprouting from their bodies. Archaeologists looked at these images for a long time before agreeing reluctantly that, yes, the most reasonable interpretation is that someone, thousands of years ago, ate something extraordinary, saw something they couldn't explain, and immediately reached for the nearest wall to tell everybody about it. Welcome to the very beginning of the story. Think about that for a moment. Before the wheel, before writing, before anyone had figured out that you could plant a seed and come back later to find food, someone was already doing fieldwork on altered states of consciousness. There were no peer-reviewed journals, no ethics review boards, no pamphlets explaining what to expect. There was just a person, a fire, a fungus, and whatever happened next. And what happened next across cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years appears to have been remarkably consistent. Anthropologists studying indigenous traditions from Siberia to sub-Saharan Africa to the Americas have found the same basic shape. A person trained over many years, a plant or fungus consumed in a ritual context, and an experience interpreted as contact with something beyond the ordinary world. The Stropharia cubensis mushroom grew naturally in the dung of cattle across large parts of Asia and Central America. Ergot fungus contaminated rye crops across ancient Europe. The peyote cactus dotted the Chihuahuan Desert. Wherever humans settled, it seems, the natural world provided something that, when consumed carefully and interpreted through cultural context, produced experiences that the people who had them found undeniably significant. This is not a coincidence. It is, if anything, one of the more reliable facts about human beings. Given access to something that temporarily reorganizes how the mind works, people will use it, and they will build meaning around the experience. The difference between the ancient world and the modern one is not that ancient people were more spiritually open or more chemically adventurous. It's that ancient people had no framework except the sacred to explain what was happening to them, and so the sacred is what it became. The ethnobotanist Richard Evans Schultz spent decades in the Amazon cataloguing plant medicines used by indigenous peoples, and came back with a simple, slightly humbling conclusion. The pharmacological knowledge embedded in traditional plant practices represented thousands of years of careful empirical observation. These weren't people stumbling around in the dark eating random things and hoping for the best. They were scientists working without laboratories, accumulating data across generations in the only way available to them, through practice, transmission, and memory. The cave paintings in Algeria are not a curiosity from the edge of history. They are the opening page of a story that runs continuously from 9000 BCE to the present moment, passing through Greek mystery cults, Aztec, temples, Swiss chemistry labs, CIA black sites, San Francisco ballrooms, and eventually a clinical trial in Baltimore where a man in his 60s, wearing an eye mask and listening to a curated playlist, discovers something about his own grief that 4 decades of conventional therapy had never touched. It started with a mushroom on a rock wall. It hasn't stopped since. And if you had to pick a single fact about humanity that was both profoundly strange and somehow deeply reassuring, it might be this. For as long as we have been capable of drawing on walls, we have also been looking for doors. The Aztecs called them Teonanacatl, flesh of the gods, and they were not being poetic, they were being literal. For the Aztec civilization, psilocybin mushrooms weren't recreational substances tucked away at a party. They were central to religious ceremonies, consumed by priests and rulers in rituals designed to open a direct line to the divine. Spanish conquistadors arriving in the 1500s were horrified. Here were these sophisticated, architecturally ambitious, calendar-inventing people, and they were eating mushrooms at their own coronations. The Spanish promptly tried to ban the whole thing, declared it devil worship, and spent the next several hundred years pretending it had never happened. It had absolutely happened. The ceremonies were not casual. You did not simply wake up one morning, find a mushroom, and eat it while going about your business. The use of Teonanacatl was embedded in a system of ritual that required preparation, intention, and the oversight of trained spiritual specialists. Ceremonies took place at night, in darkness, often in the temples that dominated the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, the same city that would later become Mexico City, sitting under layers of concrete and metro lines that commuters ride every morning without knowing what is buried beneath their feet. Participants fasted beforehand. The mushrooms were consumed with a reverence, sometimes accompanied by cacao. Yes, chocolate had a ceremonial role too, which is perhaps the most relatable detail in this entire history. Music was played. The experience was interpreted through a sophisticated cosmological framework in which the visions encountered were understood not as hallucinations, but as genuine contact with divine forces. Tlaloc, the rain god, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, the vast pantheon of Aztec spiritual life made temporarily perceptible. This was not entertainment. This was theology and practice. The Mixtec culture, neighbours and contemporaries of the Aztecs, left behind a record of mushroom use in their codices, the painted books that survived the Spanish destruction of indigenous manuscripts. One of these, the Codex Vindobonensis, depicts the god Quetzalcoatl distributing mushrooms to other deities. In the Mixtec conception, the mushrooms did not merely simulate the divine, they were divine. You weren't taking something to feel closer to God. The mushroom was God, in a form you could hold. The Mazatec people of Oaxaca carried a version of this tradition into the 20th century, protecting it through 400 years of colonial suppression with a combination of discretion, adaptation, and the geographic isolation of their mountain villages. It was among the Mazatec that a New York banker named R. Gordon Wasson would encounter the practice in 1955, more on that later, and bring it to the attention of a Western world that had spent centuries insisting it didn't exist. The Mazatec healer who guided him, a woman named Maria Sabina, would later say that the arrival of outsiders destroyed something that had been kept sacred for generations. She was not wrong. But that is also a later chapter. What matters here is the scale of what was suppressed. The Spanish colonial project did not merely outlaw mushroom ceremonies, it prosecuted them through the Inquisition, burning indigenous manuscripts, executing practitioners, and systematically dismantling a body of knowledge that had been accumulated across centuries. What survived did so underground, passed quietly between practitioners who understood that certain things were too important and too dangerous to say out loud. The Aztec Empire fell in 1521. The Spanish replaced the temples with churches, sometimes building one directly on top of the other, a physical metaphor for the cultural project underway. But the mushrooms kept growing. They grew in the fields and the forests, indifferent to colonial policy, waiting with the particular patience of things that do not require human permission to exist. The flesh of the gods was not destroyed. It was just asked to wait. Deep in the Amazon rainforest, long before anyone from outside had ever heard of it, there existed a brew so complex, so pharmacologically precise, that modern scientists genuinely cannot explain how it was invented. Ayahuasca requires the combination of two specific plants, the Banisteropsis caapi vine and the Psychotria viridis leaf, and neither one does very much on its own. Together, however, they produce one of the most powerful psychedelic experiences known to humanity. The odds of stumbling upon this exact combination by accident are roughly equivalent to accidentally inventing a car by randomly combining metals. Indigenous Amazonian peoples have been drinking it for at least 1,000 years, probably much longer, in ceremonies guided by trained healers called curanderos or ayahuasqueros, people who spent decades learning how to navigate whatever came through that door. The pharmacology, when you examine it, is genuinely startling. The Psychotria viridis leaf contains DMT, dimethyltryptamine, one of the most potent psychedelic compounds known to science. Under normal circumstances, DMT is broken down immediately by an enzyme in the human gut and never reaches the brain. It does absolutely nothing when ingested alone. The Banisteropsis caapi vine, however, contains monoamine oxidase inhibitors, MAOIs, which block that enzyme, allowing the DMT to pass into the bloodstream and cross the blood-brain barrier. The combination produces a psychedelic experience lasting 4 to 6 hours. In the modern pharmaceutical world, discovering this interaction would require a team of trained biochemists, years of research, and a significant budget. In the Amazon, it was figured out by people who did not have the concept of biochemistry and explained the mechanism differently. They said the plants told them. The experience of ayahuasca is unlike any other psychedelic encounter in its character. Participants routinely report contact with what they describe as entities or presences, beings of various forms who communicate information, offer healing, or confront the person with aspects of themselves they have been avoiding. Purging is a central part of the experience. Nausea and vomiting are common. And within the ceremonial framework, this is understood not as an unpleasant side effect, but as a form of physical and emotional release. You are, in the cosmology of Amazonian plant medicine, getting rid of something. What that something is tends to vary per person, and the specificity with which people describe what they needed to release has made researchers studying the therapeutic applications of ayahuasca very interested and slightly lost for clinical language. The ceremony is not a solo experience. The ayahuasquero or curandera sits with participants throughout the night, singing ikajos, healing songs learned during a years-long apprenticeship that typically involves a strict diet called the dieta, isolation in the jungle, and a gradual process of attuning the healer's awareness to the qualities of specific plants. The icaros are not background music. They are understood within the tradition as the primary therapeutic technology, the means by which the healer navigates and directs the experience for each participant. Modern researchers who have recorded these ceremonies and analysed the music have noted that the melodies are extraordinarily precise, varying in response to what specific participants appear to be going through at specific moments. This is not improvisation. It is expertise of a deeply specific kind. When the first Western researchers arrived in the Amazon and encountered ayahuasca ceremonies in the 20th century, their initial response was often to describe the indigenous practice as superstition layered over a pharmacological accident. That interpretation has not aged well. The knowledge embedded in these traditions about which plants to use, in what ratios, under what conditions, with what preparation, for what kinds of people and what kinds of problems, represents a body of clinical knowledge that took centuries to accumulate and is still only partially understood by the researchers now studying it under controlled conditions. The vine, the curanderos say, is a teacher. It has its own intelligence, its own intentions, its own relationship with the people who drink it. Whether or not you find that framework plausible, one thing is difficult to dispute. Whatever the Amazon's peoples found in those rivers and forests, they found it carefully, preserved it deliberately, and carried it forward across generations at considerable personal cost. That is not the behaviour of people who stumbled onto something by accident. That is the behaviour of people who found something genuinely important and refused to let it go. For nearly 2,000 years, the city-state of Athens ran a yearly religious ceremony so secretive that revealing what happened inside was punishable by death. Philosophers, generals, poets, and emperors attended. Plato went, Cicero went, Pindar went and wrote about it in terms suggesting it changed everything he thought he knew. The ceremony was called the Eleusinian Mysteries, held at the sanctuary of Demeter in Eleusis, and at its centre was a ritual drink called kykeon. For a very long time, historians assumed kykeon was essentially a mild grain porridge with spiritual branding. Then, in the 1970s, a group of very persistent researchers, a classicist, a mycologist, and an ethnobotanist, looked more carefully and suggested something else entirely, that kykeon was spiked with ergot, a fungus that grows on grain and happens to be the natural precursor to LSD. Ancient Greece may have been running a psychedelic ritual for 2 millennia and telling everyone it was just a mystery. It was the most exclusive event in human history, and the guest list included the entire Western philosophical tradition. The Eleusinian mysteries were tied to the myth of Demeter and Persephone, the story of a mother searching for her kidnapped daughter in the underworld, of death and return, of grain buried in the dark and emerging in spring. The myth is, structurally speaking, a story about transformation, going somewhere terrifying and coming back changed. Those who attended the mysteries and drank the kykeon, the sacred barley drink mixed with water and the herb pennyroyal, reported experiences that participants consistently described, in the writings that survive, as a vision of death and rebirth, a removal of the fear of dying, a sense of profound understanding that could not quite be translated into ordinary language afterwards. Cicero, the Roman statesman and not exactly a man given to easy mysticism, wrote that the mysteries gave him not just a reason to live joyfully, but a reason to die without terror. Plato's description of the soul's journey after death in several dialogues bears a suspicious structural resemblance to the kind of experience contemporary researchers describe under psilocybin or LSD, a dissolution of the ordinary self, a traversal of something vast and frightening, an arrival at something that feels, however briefly, like understanding. Scholars have debated for decades whether Plato was describing philosophy or something he'd actually experienced. The answer may be both. The three researchers who proposed the ergot hypothesis, Gordon Wasson, Albert Hofmann, and Carl Ruck, published their argument in a book called The Road to Eleusis in 1978. Hofmann, who had synthesized LSD from ergot compounds in the 1940s, was in an unusual position to assess the pharmacological plausibility of the claim. His conclusion was that the combination of ergot-derived compounds with the specific preparation described in ancient sources was entirely consistent with producing a profound psychedelic experience. The book was controversial. It remains controversial. But no one has produced a more convincing explanation for why 2,000 years of participants, across every level of Athenian society, described their experience of drinking grain porridge in more or less the same way they described seeing the gods. The mysteries ran for roughly 2,000 years before being shut down by the Christian Emperor Theodosius in 392 CE. The sanctuary at Eleusis was destroyed shortly afterward. Whatever specific knowledge the priest held about the preparation of kykeon, which plants, which ratios, which procedures, died with the institution. We will probably never know exactly what was in the cup. What we know is that it worked reliably, and that it worked on some of the most sophisticated minds of the ancient world in ways they found genuinely transformative. There is something quietly extraordinary about this. The Parthenon stands in Athens as an emblem of Western civilization's origins, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and rational inquiry. 20 miles down the road, every autumn, the philosophers who built that civilization were drinking something from a cup, lying down in a dark temple and spending a night in a state of consciousness that most of them considered the most significant experience of their lives. The marble and the mushroom were, it turns out, part of the same story. They always were. For the native peoples of what is now northern Mexico and the southwestern United States, the peyote cactus was not a drug. It was a teacher, a living ancient sacred presence that required preparation, respect, and the guidance of a trained ceremony leader before you went anywhere near it. The Huichol people, the Navajo, the Comanche, and dozens of other nations incorporated peyote into religious practices that were precise, structured, and deeply communal. There were prayers before the ceremony, prayers during, prayers after. There was fasting, singing, fire tending, and the careful presence of healers who had spent years learning what peyote wanted from a person before a person was allowed to ask anything of it. Then European settlers arrived, decided this looked suspicious, and spent the next 100 years trying to make it illegal. The Huichol, who call themselves the Wixariteri, make an annual pilgrimage to the Wirikuta Desert in the state of San Luis Potosí, a journey of several hundred miles that retraces the original path their ancestors walked to find the peyote cactus. The pilgrimage takes weeks. It involves fasting, prayer, and the confessing of every intimate relationship the pilgrim has ever had, all of them in sequence, publicly, to the group. This is not metaphorical. Everyone participates. The idea is to arrive at the sacred desert place carrying nothing hidden, nothing held back, nothing that could obstruct what the peyote is about to show you. Think of it as the most thorough intake form in the history of medicine, conducted on foot, in the desert, over several weeks. Your therapist's initial paperwork has nothing on the Wixaritari pilgrimage. Peyote ceremonies, called mitote among many plains nations, are all-night events organised around a central fire, a crescent-shaped altar of earth, and a ceremonial leader called the roadman, who guides the group through prayers, songs, and the consumption of the cactus buttons over many hours. The songs sung during peyote ceremonies are specific, learned over years, and understood to carry their own healing properties. The drum and the rattle that accompany them are not rhythm sections. They are understood as functional elements of the ceremony, as necessary as the fire. Participants face east by the time dawn comes, and the closing of the ceremony with the first light is understood as a moment of rebirth, the same mythic arc of death and return that appears in different language across almost every culture that has worked with these medicines. The pharmacology of peyote is built around mescaline, an alkaloid that produces profound visual and perceptual alterations over a 6 to 12 hour window. What mescaline does in the brain overlaps meaningfully with what psilocybin and LSD do. Significant disruption of the default mode network, dramatically increased communication between usually separate brain regions, a temporary loosening of the grip that ordinary self-referential thought has on awareness. The experience tends to be described as enormously visual, emotionally charged, and possessed of a quality of profundity that is difficult to convey in retrospect, which is a characteristic shared, it turns out, by nearly every classic psychedelic when used in a well-supported context. The suppression of peyote use began in the 1880s, as the US government's campaign to eliminate indigenous religious practices intensified. Peyote ceremonies were specifically targeted, along with the sun dance, the ghost dance, and the sweat lodge, anything that might function as a locus of cultural cohesion and resistance. In 1918, the Native American Church was formally incorporated, in part as a legal strategy to protect the ceremonial use of peyote under the First Amendment. The battle continued for decades, with peyote alternately persecuted and tolerated depending on state, decade, and political climate. Federal protection for Native American church members wasn't fully established until the American Indian Religious Freedom Act amendments of 1994. A religious practice that had existed for at least 5,000 years was granted legal protection in the United States for the first time 1 year before the internet went public. The peyote cactus grows slowly. A full-grown button takes 15 years to mature. The overharvesting, driven partly by non-indigenous demand in recent decades, has created a serious conservation crisis. The Wixaritari have said, with remarkable consistency and patience, that peyote is not for everyone, that it belongs to a specific cultural and ceremonial context that cannot be separated from the medicine itself without losing something essential. That position is not always received comfortably by a culture accustomed to extracting the active compound, isolating the mechanism, and assuming the context was optional. The evidence so far suggests the Wixaritari may have a point. On the 16th of April, 1943, a mild-mannered Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann was doing routine lab work at the Sandoz Pharmaceutical Company in Basel when he accidentally absorbed a tiny amount of a compound he had synthesized 5 years earlier and never thought much of. Lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD-25, had been sitting quietly in a drawer. 40 minutes after the accidental exposure, Hofmann noted in his lab journal that he felt peculiarly dizzy and was experiencing an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes, with an intense kaleidoscopic play of colours. He went home and lay down. He was fine. He was also technically the first person in modern history to have a psychedelic experience without any cultural or ceremonial context to explain it to him. 3 days later, on what is now celebrated among a very specific community as Bicycle Day, Hofmann intentionally took a larger dose, got on his bike to ride home, and had an experience so intense that he was briefly convinced he was dying. He was not dying. He had just invented the 20th century's most controversial molecule. The dose Hoffmann took on that April afternoon was 250 micrograms, a quantity so small it would fit on the point of a pin, barely visible to the naked eye. This was itself extraordinary. No pharmacologically active substance previously known required so little material to produce such a dramatic effect. The implications took a while to sink in, but they were enormous. If something this potent could be absorbed through the skin accidentally, what did that mean for water supplies, for mass production, for warfare? These questions would soon attract attention from parties that had no interest in spiritual experience whatsoever. Hoffmann spent the rest of his long life. He died in 2008 at the age of 102, which may or may not be coincidence, insisting that LSD was not the dangerous thing history decided it was, but a problem child, misunderstood, misused, but fundamentally important. He called his discovery a medicine for the soul, and spent decades writing, lecturing, and gently, but persistently pushing back against its demonization. He was a careful, methodical man who had spent his career studying natural compounds, and the accidental discovery of LSD struck him not as aberration, but as a gift, something pressed into his hands by a process that felt, to him, distinctly non-random. Sandoz, the pharmaceutical company, recognized quickly that they had something unusual on their hands. They began producing LSD under the trade name Delicid and distributing it to psychiatrists and researchers worldwide in the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s, essentially as a research tool. The idea was that LSD produced a state resembling acute psychosis. Early on it was called a psychotomimetic, a psychosis mimicker, and that studying it might help researchers understand the biochemical basis of schizophrenia. That framework turned out to be largely wrong, but the distribution network it created put LSD into the hands of thousands of researchers, psychiatrists, and eventually everyone else. The 1950s saw an explosion of legitimate research. Thousands of papers were published. Alcoholism studies showed remarkable results. Anxiety in terminally ill patients was treated with striking success. Therapists working with LSD reported that patients could access and process memories and emotional material in a single session that might otherwise take years of conventional psychotherapy to approach. Aldous Huxley, who had taken mescaline in 1953 and written about it in The Doors of Perception, met Hoffmann and considered him something between a colleague and a prophet. The molecule was, for a brief window, taken seriously by serious people. Then the 1960s happened. Then Timothy Leary happened. Then the counterculture happened. And the molecule that Hoffmann had found quietly in a Basel laboratory became a symbol of something that powerful people found threatening, not because it was dangerous in the ordinary sense, but because people who took it sometimes came back from the experience less willing to accept things they had previously accepted without question. That, it turned out, was a different kind of dangerous entirely. In the 1950s, the United States government looked at LSD, a brand new, barely understood psychedelic compound, and its first thought was, what if we used this as a weapon? Thus began one of the most genuinely bizarre programs in American intelligence history. Project MKUltra was the CIA's covert research program. Into mind control, and LSD was its star subject. Scientists were funded to dose unwitting citizens, mental patients, prisoners, soldiers, and on at least one occasion, completely random people in a San Francisco apartment to see what happened. What happened was chaos, trauma, lawsuits, and at least one death. Frank Olson, a government scientist, fell from a New York hotel window in 1953 after being secretly dosed by his colleagues. The full scope of MKUltra wasn't revealed until the Church Committee hearings in 1975, and even then the CIA had already destroyed most of the files. The government had been running an involuntary psychedelic experiment on its own population, and somehow this is one of the less surprising things in this story. The program began in 1953 under the direction of CIA officer Richard Helms, and was run day to day by a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb, a man who in another life might have been a perfectly pleasant organic chemist and amateur folk dancer. He was, in fact, an amateur folk dancer. He was also the man who oversaw the dosing of unwitting American citizens with LSD, the funding of experiments involving sensory deprivation, electroconvulsive therapy, hypnosis, and a variety of drugs in quantities that would make a reasonable person's eyes water, and the systematic investigation of whether human beings could be made to do things against their will through chemical manipulation. The answer, as far as LSD was concerned, was largely no. It turned out that giving someone a powerful psychedelic compound did not make them suggestible and controllable. It mostly made them confused and terrified, which was useful for neither espionage nor cooperation. The safe houses where some of the more theatrical experiments took place were called Operation Midnight Climax. The CIA funded what were effectively apartments in San Francisco and New York, hired sex workers to lure men in off the street, dosed them with LSD without their knowledge, and observed the results from behind one-way mirrors. The operatives drinking cocktails on the other side of the mirror were also, on occasion, dosed without their knowledge. The program generated extensive notes and very little actionable intelligence, which is perhaps the least surprising finding in the history of government programs. The institutional logic, if you can call it that, was shaped by Cold War paranoia. American intelligence had seen what appeared to be brainwashing in Korean War POWs, and were convinced the Soviets had developed some form of chemical mind control. The race to develop it first, or to understand how to defend against it, produced a moral environment in which experimentation on unwitting subjects seemed, to at least some of the people involved, like a reasonable national security measure. It was not a reasonable national security measure. It was a series of crimes conducted by an intelligence agency, operating without oversight, in conditions of complete secrecy, against people who had no idea what was being done to them. Frank Olson's death in 1953 was ruled a suicide at the time. His son Eric spent decades pursuing the truth, eventually winning a settlement from the US government and continuing to argue publicly that his father was murdered, pushed from the window when it became clear he was having a crisis of conscience about the program. In 2012, Eric Olson had his father's body exhumed. The forensic examination found evidence consistent with a blow to the head prior to the fall. The case has never been officially reclassified. The government has never formally admitted to murder. Frank Olson remains, 30 years after MKUltra became public knowledge, one of the most significant unresolved questions in American intelligence history. He was a scientist who worked on a program he came to regret. He was dosed without his consent, and he went out of a window. What the files that were destroyed might have told us about what happened that night, we will never know. If Albert Hofmann invented LSD, Timothy Leary invented the idea that everyone should have some immediately. A Harvard psychology professor with a flair for publicity that would have impressed a modern social media manager, Leary began his psychedelic research with genuine scientific intentions in the early 1960s, studying psilocybin's effects on prisoners, theology students, and eventually himself at an alarming frequency. His conclusions were enormous. Psychedelics could transform consciousness, reduce recidivism, and possibly trigger spiritual experiences indistinguishable from the world's great religious traditions. Harvard disagreed and fired him. Leary responded by moving to a mansion in Millbrook, New York, declaring a psychedelic revolution and appearing on every available television program to tell America's parents exactly what their children were about to discover. Richard Nixon would later call him the most dangerous man in America, which was perhaps the best review Leary ever received. The Harvard Psilocybin Project, which Leary co-ran with his colleague Richard Alpert, later known as Ram Dass, produced 2 studies that are still cited today. The Concord prison experiment attempted to reduce recidivism among released prisoners through psilocybin-assisted group therapy. The Marsh Chapel experiment, conducted on Good Friday of 1962, gave psilocybin to theology students and found that the majority reported experiences indistinguishable from classical mystical states as described in the world's religious literature. Both studies had methodological problems. Both pointed towards something real. Both contributed to Leary's growing conviction that he had found something more important than a research program, something more like a religion. This is where Leary's story gets complicated. He was simultaneously a brilliant researcher, a reckless self-promoter, and a man so thoroughly convinced of his own rightness that he consistently overreached in ways that damaged the cause he believed he was advancing. His public pronouncements, turn on, tune in, drop out, became the defining slogan, offered in a San Francisco ballroom in January of 1967, with a kind of rhetorical grenades that win a crowd and lose a political battle. Every time Leary went on television and told America's young people that LSD would liberate them from conformity, he made it marginally easier for lawmakers to associate psychedelics with social disorder, and marginally harder for researchers to maintain the institutional credibility necessary to keep clinical work going. His personal life reflected the same spectacular disregard for caution. He was arrested multiple times on marijuana possession charges, escaped from prison in 1970 with the help of the Weather Underground, fled to Algeria, then Switzerland, then Afghanistan, where he was captured by US agents and extradited back to American custody. The man who'd been a Harvard professor in a tweed jacket in 1961 was a fugitive in Kabul in 1973. The trajectory is either a cautionary tale or an extraordinarily vivid adventure story depending on how you approach it. Leary spent his final years rehabilitated. In a sense, he became a popular figure on the early internet, fascinated by computers and cyberspace as the new frontier of consciousness expansion, and died in 1996 of prostate cancer. His last words reportedly were, "Why not?" He was 75. Whatever his failures of judgment, whatever damage his grandstanding did to the serious clinical work he helped initiate, the research he and Alpert began at Harvard in the early 1960s planted seeds that took 60 years to flower. The men and women running clinical trials today cite the Marsh Chapel experiment in their literature reviews. The thread is unbroken. It just had to survive a very long detour. While Timothy Leary was doing his psychedelic revolution in a blazer and with footnotes, Ken Kesey was doing his with a school bus painted in fluorescent colours, a 40-person entourage, and absolutely no footnotes whatsoever. Kesey, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, had first taken LSD as part of a government-funded volunteer trial. Yes, the government was still handing it out to writers in the early 1960s, which is a sentence that requires a moment. He came out of that experience convinced that LSD needed to be shared not in laboratories, but in life, and in 1964 he and a group of friends called the Merry Pranksters climbed into a bus named Further and drove across America, throwing events called acid tests, parties where LSD was served freely, and the only rule was that there were no rules. It was either the most important social experiment of the decade or a very loud party. Historians still disagree. The pranksters were not philosophers or researchers, or even particularly systematic about anything. They were, in the truest sense, experimenters, people who had encountered something that had reorganized their perception of reality, and were now curious what would happen if everyone else encountered it too, simultaneously, with music playing and strobe lights running. The acid tests took place in garages, warehouses, and ballrooms across California. The Grateful Dead, then still called the Warlocks, played at several of them. The experience of attending one was, by all accounts, like nothing that had existed before in American public life. People arrived expecting a party and left having had an experience they struggled to categorize. Tom Wolfe chronicled this period in The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, published in 1968, a book so vivid and propulsive that it essentially created the journalistic template for writing about altered states, the first-person adjacent, deeply saturated, we were all there and none of us were, ready style that has been borrowed from ever since. Wolfe was not a participant in the psychedelic sense, but was present enough to render the scene with documentary precision. His portrait of Kesey is sympathetic without being uncritical, a man of genuine charisma and genuine recklessness, leading a group of people through an experiment whose parameters were unclear to everyone, including him. The bus itself, further, was driven by Neal Cassady, the same Neal Cassady who had been Jack Kerouac's muse in On the Road, now driving a psychedelic school bus across America in what was either the sequel to The Beat Generation or its logical conclusion. Cassady drove without sleeping for days at a stretch. He talked in continuous monologue. He was, by most accounts, operating at a frequency that other humans found difficult to keep up with, and he was doing it long before anyone gave him a compound to help. The pranksters found in him a kind of human mascot for the idea that ordinary consciousness was simply moving too slowly. What Kesey understood, and what separated the pranksters from the clinical researchers, was that LSD's effects were profoundly shaped by context. The term set and setting, popularized by Leary but grasped intuitively by Kesey, refers to the fact that a psychedelic experience is not simply a pharmacological event, but an interaction between the compound, the person's expectations, and the environment in which it takes place. The clinical researchers knew this in theory. Kesey acted on it in practice, by making the context as chaotic and vivid and music-filled and deliberately overwhelming as possible to see what would emerge. What emerged, often, was a sense of profound collective connection. Strangers in a warehouse feeling briefly like members of the same extended family. That feeling did not last beyond the next morning. But the memory of it lasted decades. If you wanted a single moment when psychedelics went from scientific curiosity and counterculture experiment to full-blown mass cultural phenomenon, it would be the summer of 1967 in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury neighborhood. Roughly 100,000 young people arrived in a city that had not invited them, carrying flowers, guitars, and considerably more LSD than the local police were equipped to understand. The Grateful Dead played for free, Jefferson Airplane played for free, Ravi Shankar played sitar for a crowd that had not previously known what a sitar was, and was now deeply moved by it. LSD was still legal in California until October of that year, which meant the Summer of Love existed in a brief, strange window where an entire neighborhood was openly practicing a form of consciousness expansion that the federal government was in the process of deciding it very much disliked. It ended, as most utopias do, messily, but for one season, it really did feel like something new was happening. The Haight-Ashbury neighborhood had been a working-class Victorian district that had, by the mid-1960s, become unusually cheap to live in, which attracted artists, musicians, and eventually the vanguard of what would become the counterculture. The intersection of Haight and Ashbury streets became the unofficial centre of a social experiment that had no clear leadership structure, no formal ideology, and no exit strategy. This is both its greatest charm and the primary reason it fell apart. Movements that are built entirely on vibes and a shared supply of LSD have a structural weakness. The morning after, the cultural output was real and lasting. The music that emerged from the Haight in that period, the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Big Brother and the Holding Company, Quicksilver Messenger Service was shaped directly by the psychedelic experience in the sense that the musicians were writing from inside that experience and performing for audiences who were in it alongside them. The concerts were not performances in the conventional sense. They were shared rituals. The light shows that accompanied the music, projectors, oils and hand-operated colour wheels creating the visual analogue of what the music was doing sonically, were the first attempts to make the interior landscape of the psychedelic experience visible to an audience. You could argue they were the first immersive art installations built in San Francisco ballrooms in 1967, with equipment borrowed from science classrooms. The newspapers covered the Summer of Love with a mixture of fascination and alarm that would be recognizable to anyone who has watched cable news discuss anything. The young people in the hate were simultaneously portrayed as harbingers of a new consciousness and as a public health problem. Both characterizations had some basis in reality. The neighborhood was, by late summer, genuinely overwhelmed. Makeshift clinics were operating to deal with bad trips, malnutrition, hepatitis, and the various other consequences of several thousand people living in close quarters without adequate sanitation or resources. The Diggers, a radical community group, ran free food programs out of a park. The medical clinic they established, the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, is still operating today. What ended the Summer of Love, really, was a combination of factors: the onset of autumn, the arrival of harder drugs that had a different and considerably less idealistic effect on the community, the presence of people who recognized that idealistic young people with limited resources were exploitable, and the basic human difficulty of sustaining a utopia when the water heater breaks and nobody agreed on whose job it was to fix it. In October of 1967, a group of community members held a mock funeral called the Death of the Hippie. They marched through the Haight carrying a coffin to announce that what had been was over. History often moves this way. Something enormous and genuinely transformative happens. People briefly understand its scale, and then it ends before anyone worked out how to make it last. In 1970, Richard Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act, and in doing so ended what had been, by almost any measure, one of the most productive decades in the history of psychiatric research. LSD and psilocybin were placed in Schedule 1, the most restricted category, reserved for substances with no accepted medical use and high potential for abuse. This was despite the fact that by that point, over 1,000 peer-reviewed studies had been published on LSD's clinical applications, including promising research into alcoholism, end-of-life anxiety, and treatment-resistant depression. The research stopped overnight, not because the science had failed, but because the politics had arrived. For the next 4 decades, studying psychedelics required navigating a bureaucratic maze so elaborate it made actual research nearly impossible. The irony was not lost on researchers. The government had shut down a scientific field using the same scheduling system that classified marijuana as more dangerous than methamphetamine. It would take 30 years for anyone to meaningfully pick up where they left off. The decision to place psychedelics in Schedule 1 was, by the admission of people involved in the process at the time, not primarily a medical or scientific determination. John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy chief, later said in a 1994 interview, published after his death, that the war on drugs was designed with 2 specific enemies in mind: the anti-war left and black Americans. Psychedelics were associated with the counterculture. The counterculture was associated with opposition to the Vietnam War. And scheduling LSD was a mechanism for criminalizing the communities built around it. This is not a fringe interpretation. It is a direct statement from a senior member of the administration that enacted the policy. The consequences for science were immediate and severe. Researchers who had been actively running clinical trials received letters notifying them that their subjects could no longer be legally given the substances under study. Ongoing trials were halted. Institutional review boards that had approved psychedelic research withdrew their approval. Universities that had been hosting research programs quietly closed them. A body of scientific knowledge that had accumulated over 2 decades was not refuted. It was simply made inaccessible, classified into illegibility, and left to sit in archives that most researchers could not access without triggering DEA scrutiny. The handful of researchers who attempted to continue working in the field found themselves in an essentially impossible position. The compounds they needed to study required DEA, Schedule I researcher licenses, which required institutional support, which required universities unwilling to take the political and legal risk, which made institutional support effectively unavailable. It was a closed loop that kept the field frozen for 3 decades. The patients who might have benefited from treatments that the existing research suggested were highly effective continued to receive treatments that were known to be less effective, because the political climate had made the more effective treatments illegal to study. There is a particular cruelty to this that becomes clearest in the context of end-of-life care. By the late 1960s, researchers including Stanislav Grof had published extensively on LSD-assisted therapy with terminally ill cancer patients, with results that showed dramatic reductions in death anxiety, improvements in quality of life, and what patients described as a fundamental change in their relationship to dying. When the research was halted, these patients, and the generations that followed them, died without access to a treatment that the existing evidence suggested could have helped them face their deaths with something closer to peace. The political decision made in 1970 is still, decades later, having consequences in hospital rooms and hospice beds. That is not a metaphor. It is a straightforward accounting of the cost. While the official scientific world had closed its doors to psychedelic research, a small network of researchers, therapists and chemists kept working anyway, quietly, carefully, and in some cases illegally. Alexander Sasha Shulgin, a Berkeley-trained chemist with a DEA Schedule I researcher license and a remarkable personal laboratory in his backyard, synthesized and tested hundreds of psychedelic compounds through the 1970s and 80s, meticulously documenting each one in books that would later become essential references for an entire generation of underground chemists. He invented MDMA's modern medical context. He catalogued compounds no one had ever encountered. His books, Pikal and Tikal, Phenethylamines and Tryptamines I Have Known and Loved, are either the most important pharmacological memoirs ever written or the most unusual recipe books in history, depending on who you ask. Shulgin was not technically acting illegally for most of his career. His DEA license gave him legitimate authority to synthesize and possess scheduled substances for research purposes. What the DEA presumably did not anticipate was that he would use this license to test several hundred novel psychoactive compounds on himself and a small group of carefully selected volunteers in his home, document the results with the methodical precision of a scientist and the prose style of a man who genuinely enjoyed what he was doing, and then publish the synthesis routes for all of them in books available to the general public. When the DEA eventually came to audit his laboratory in 1994, they found everything in order, revoked his license anyway, and fined him for the possession of an unlicensed Schedule I substance, in amounts exceeding what the license permitted. The fine was $25,000. He had synthesized over 200 novel compounds. These are not proportionate numbers. The underground therapeutic community that survived the scheduling of LSD and psilocybin was small but serious. A network of therapists, primarily in the United States and Europe, continued offering psychedelic-assisted sessions to carefully screened clients, operating outside legal frameworks, but within ethical ones they developed themselves. These practitioners kept records, supervised sessions, and developed integration protocols, the systematic work of helping clients process and incorporate what they had experienced, long before the term integration became standard in the field. Their work was invisible to mainstream science and entirely illegal, but it generated a body of experiential knowledge that would later inform the design of clinical trials when the field eventually reopened. Stanislav Grof, a Czech psychiatrist who had conducted extensive LSD research in the 1960s before the scheduling, responded to the loss of legal access to psychedelics by developing a non-drug method for producing comparable states, holotropic breathwork, which he developed with his wife Christina, uses accelerated breathing patterns, evocative music, and focused bodywork to produce altered states of consciousness that Grof argued were pharmacologically distinct from but experientially similar to LSD states. It was a creative and, by many accounts, genuinely effective response to a problem. How do you continue exploring this territory when the most direct route has been blocked? You find another path. Grof spent the next several decades training facilitators in holotropic breathwork, building a global network of practitioners who maintained continuity with the psychedelic research tradition, using a method that required no prescription and no DEA license. The underground was not, it should be said, without its problems. The absence of regulatory frameworks meant the absence of accountability. There were practitioners who took advantage of clients in vulnerable states, who failed to screen appropriately for contraindications, who operated from ideological commitments that distorted their clinical judgment. These failures would eventually contribute to the difficult conversations around ethical standards and therapist behavior that the resurgent clinical field would need to have in the 2020s. But the underground also preserved something that could not be preserved in any other way: the living knowledge of how to actually hold these experiences, passed from practitioner to practitioner through direct transmission across 3 decades of official darkness. When the field reopened, the people waiting at the door had been there a long time, and they had not been idle. MDMA, 3,4-methylene-deoxymethamphetamine, which you will absolutely not be tested on, was first synthesized by Merck in 1912 and then largely ignored for 6 decades. Sasha Shulgin rediscovered it in the late 1970s, tested it on himself, and immediately wrote that it produced an easily controlled altered state of consciousness with emotional and sensual overtones. He passed it along to a psychotherapist named Leo Zeff, who spent years quietly introducing it to therapists across the United States as an aid for couples therapy and trauma work, calling it Adam. For a period in the early 1980s, MDMA was an unscheduled, semi-secret therapeutic tool used by a network of licensed clinicians who found it opened emotional doors in patients that had been sealed for decades. Then someone renamed it ecstasy, put it in nightclubs, and the DEA scheduled it. In 1985, the therapeutic use went underground. The nightclub use did not. Leo Zeff was not a headline figure. He was a psychotherapist in Oakland who had previously worked with LSD before its scheduling, and who recognized in MDMA something that addressed a specific clinical problem: the difficulty many trauma patients experience accessing emotionally charged material in therapy. Conventional talk therapy relies on the patient's ability to discuss painful experiences while remaining regulated, present enough to process but not so flooded with emotion that the defensive systems that protect against that pain shut the conversation down entirely. For patients with significant trauma histories, this balance is extraordinarily difficult to maintain. MDMA, Zeff found, produced a state in which patients could approach the most painful material of their lives with a quality of emotional openness and self-compassion that seemed, under ordinary circumstances, inaccessible to them. They could look directly at what had happened and find themselves capable of bearing it. Zeph trained hundreds of therapists in MDMA-assisted work before his death in 1988, creating a network of practitioners who worked quietly and carefully with clients throughout the decade. The therapy was not glamorous. It was 4 to 6 hours of difficult emotional work conducted in a clinical setting, with 2 therapists present throughout. Patients lay on a couch, often with an eye mask and music playing, engaging in the kind of deep interior work that the compound made possible. The results, in the case accounts that have survived from this period, were striking. Patients processing decades-old trauma in sessions that conventional therapy had circled around for years. When MDMA appeared in Dallas nightclubs around 1983 under the name ecstasy, the trajectory changed rapidly. The drug found a recreational market that valued its empathogenic properties, the sense of warmth, connection, and openness it produced, without any therapeutic context around it. It spread quickly, became associated with the same cultural anxieties that had surrounded LSD in the 60s and attracted DEE attention. A small group of therapists and researchers attempted to block the scheduling through an administrative hearing process, arguing that MDMA had demonstrated medical utility and that Schedule I placement would end beneficial research. Administrative Judge Francis Young agreed with them and recommended Schedule III. The DEA administrator overrode the recommendation and placed MDMA in Schedule I in 1985. The therapeutic use that had been carefully built over a decade went underground within months. The moral of this particular chapter is one the psychedelic field has had to learn more than once. In a regulatory environment defined by categorical restriction, the recreational use of a substance does not merely invite legal attention, it erases the clinical history. The years of careful therapeutic work that Leo Zeph and his colleagues had conducted became, in the DEA's framing, simply more evidence of a drug of abuse. The patients who had benefited became invisible. The therapists who had been doing the work became potential criminals. One political decision reclassified a body of clinical practice as a law enforcement problem, and nobody in a position of authority stopped to ask whether that was the right framing. In 1987, a group of British DJs travelled to Ibiza, encountered a combination of MDMA and acid house music, and returned home to create a cultural explosion that transformed the United Kingdom and eventually Europe and North America with the speed and subtlety of a freight train. Rave culture, with its all-night dance events, warehouse venues, smiley face iconography, and communal sense of radical openness, became the dominant youth movement of the late 1980s and early 90s. Millions of people took MDMA at these events, not in therapy rooms under clinical supervision, but in fields in England at 3 a.m, which produced a different kind of data. The British government responded with a panic that its own researchers quietly admitted was disproportionate to the actual harm profile of the drug. They passed the Criminal Justice Act of 1994, which specifically outlawed music characterized by the emission of a succession of repetitive beats. It is genuinely a law about vibes. The acid house movement arrived in the UK through a specific and traceable route. DJs Danny Rampling, Paul Oakenfold, Nicky Holloway and Johnny Walker went to Ibiza in the summer of 1987 and encountered the DJ Alfredo spinning a seamless genre-fluid mix of music in an outdoor club called Amnesia. The atmosphere, created by the combination of a warm Mediterranean night, an extraordinary DJ and MDMA, was unlike anything they had experienced. They came home and tried to recreate it. The result was a series of club nights in London, Shoom, Spectrum, the Future, that attracted first hundreds, then thousands, then hundreds of thousands of young Britons who found in the combination of electronic music and MDMA something that felt, in the specific socio-economic grimness of Thatcher-era England, like an almost miraculous release. The communal experience of rave culture was not incidental to the MDMA, it was produced by it. The drug's empathogenic effects, the lowering of social anxiety, the amplification of emotional warmth, the sense of connection with strangers, were profoundly suited to large gatherings and shared music. People who had nothing in common became, for the duration of a night, entirely comfortable with each other. The class distinctions that structured British social life were temporarily suspended. People from very different backgrounds danced together and felt, whatever the day had been like, that they were part of something. This was not an illusion in the sense of being false. The connection people felt was real, even if its chemical substrate faded by morning. But the morning always came. The British government's response escalated steadily through the late 80s and early 90s, producing a body of legislation aimed specifically at rave culture that, viewed from a distance of 30 years, reads as a comprehensive panic about young people being happy in ways that the state had not authorised. The entertainments, increased penalties, Act of 1990, the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994, which contained the remarkable provision defining unlawful gatherings as those featuring music wholly or predominantly characterised by the omission of a succession of repetitive beats, represented a determined legislative effort to eliminate a cultural form by targeting its infrastructure. The raves moved underground, then moved to licensed venues, then became the global electronic music industry, which is currently one of the largest entertainment sectors in the world. The repetitive beats survived. What the rave era produced beyond music and legislation was an enormous population of people who had first-hand experience with MDMA and found the government's characterization of it as a dangerous drug with no redeeming properties, difficult to reconcile with their own experience. This experiential gap between the official narrative and personal knowledge would become, over the following decades, a significant driver of popular support for psychedelic reform. People who had taken MDMA in a field in 1989 and found it to be the most connected and alive they had ever felt in their lives were, by 2020, middle-aged parents and professionals. They read the MAPS clinical trial results with something more than academic interest. They recognised the compound. They had already met it. In the year 2000, a psychopharmacologist at Johns Hopkins University named Roland Griffiths received approval to conduct the first rigorously controlled study of psilocybin in over 30 years. The bureaucratic effort required to get that approval was, by multiple accounts, extraordinary. A multi-year process involving the FDA, the DEA, and enough institutional review board meetings to qualify as a mild endurance sport. But it happened, and in 2006 the results were published in the journal Psychopharmacology. Psilocybin, administered in a controlled setting with trained guides, reliably produced experiences that participants described as among the most meaningful of their lives, with lasting positive changes in mood, well-being and attitude. The scientific world did not immediately burst into applause, but something had shifted. The door that had been slammed in 1970 had opened just a crack, and the researchers waiting on the other side had been there a long time. Griffiths was not a psychedelic researcher by training or inclination. He was a behavioural pharmacologist who had spent his career studying caffeine and other drugs of dependence, careful, methodical, not the sort of person who would be associated in anyone's mind with the counterculture. His entry point into psilocybin research was a personal meditation practice that had led him to curiosity about mystical experience, combined with a scientist's instinct to ask whether the subjective reports of such experiences could be studied rigorously. The fact that someone with his profile, mainstream credentials, no history of advocacy for psychedelics, an institutional base at one of the most prestigious medical schools in the world, chose to pursue this research, and that the study was designed with such methodological rigor was itself part of the message. This was not the psychedelic movement. This was a scientist applying scientific methods to an uncomfortable question. The 2006 paper remains one of the most cited in the field. Its core finding, that psilocybin reliably produced what participants described as mystical or peak experiences, and that these experiences were associated with lasting improvements in well-being, challenged the prevailing scientific assumption that such states were either unreliable, unverifiable, or both. The paper included a follow-up at 14 months showing that participants still rated their psilocybin experience as among the 5 most personally significant events of their lives. A substantial number rated it as the single most meaningful experience they had ever had. These were not marginal or unstable findings. They replicated in subsequent studies. They replicated across different research groups in different countries. Whatever psilocybin was producing in these carefully controlled sessions, it was producing it consistently. The institutional response was cautious, as institutional responses tend to be. But behind the caution was a gathering momentum. Other researchers began approaching Griffiths about collaboration. Funding from private foundations, the Hefter Research Institute, the Beckley Foundation, eventually the philanthropist Tim Ferriss and others, began flowing into the field. New York University launched its own psilocybin research program. Imperial College London created a Centre for Psychedelic Research. The academic infrastructure of a new scientific field was being built, piece by piece, 20 years after the underground had been keeping the tradition alive in the dark. What Griffiths and his colleagues understood and communicated clearly in their early papers was that the conditions under which psilocybin was administered were not incidental to the results. The carefully prepared room, the 2 trained guides who stayed with each participant throughout the session, the music, the preparation beforehand and integration afterward, all of it was part of the intervention. You could not separate the compound from its container and expect the same result. This was not a new idea. It was what every indigenous tradition working with these substances had known for centuries. It was, however, the first time it had been stated in a peer-reviewed paper with a control group. Within a decade of the Johns Hopkins results, clinical research into psilocybin had expanded into one of the most promising frontiers in modern psychiatry. Researchers at Johns Hopkins, NYU, Imperial College London, and dozens of other institutions began running carefully designed trials, studying psilocybin's effects on treatment, resistant depression, end-of-life anxiety in cancer patients, addiction, OCD, and PTSD. The results, published in major peer-reviewed journals, were striking. In a landmark Imperial College London trial, psilocybin produced rapid, significant reductions in depression in patients for whom 6 or more conventional treatments had failed. Participants described the experience not as intoxication but as clarity, a kind of emotional reset that allowed them to examine painful memories from a distance and find them somehow less immovable than before. Psychiatrists who had spent careers watching antidepressants fail these patients found the data difficult to dismiss. The modern antidepressant story is, depending on how you read it, either a triumph of pharmacology or a quiet crisis. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSREs, have been the first-line treatment for depression and anxiety since the late 1980s, when fluoxetine was approved under the brand name Prozac. They work for many people, they work partially for many more, and for a significant minority of patients, estimates range from 20 to 30% of those diagnosed with major depressive disorder. They do not work at all, regardless of how many different drugs or dosage adjustments are tried. These patients are classified as having treatment-resistant depression. They cycle through medications, through therapists, through hospitalizations, through combinations of approaches that each provide marginal improvement or none. Some of them have been ill for decades. The standard of care for treatment-resistant depression is, by the honest assessment of most psychiatrists who treat it, inadequate. Against this backdrop, the psilocybin data landed with a specific kind of weight. A 2017 Imperial College trial led by Robin Carhart Harris studied psilocybin in patients with treatment-resistant depression who'd been ill for an average of 18 years. After 2 sessions of psilocybin-assisted therapy, all 12 participants showed significant reductions in depression scores. 3 months later, 5 of 12 remained in remission. In the context of a patient population for whom the standard definition of treatment success is any measurable improvement at all, these numbers were remarkable. They were also not placebo effects. Subsequent trials with larger groups and active placebos replicated the core finding. Psilocybin was doing something that conventional antidepressants were not. The mechanism is not fully understood, but researchers have developed plausible hypotheses. Conventional antidepressants work by modifying neurotransmitter levels on a continuous basis. You take them every day. They maintain a chemical environment that is somewhat more conducive to mood regulation, and they have to be taken indefinitely because their effects are ongoing rather than curative. Psilocybin appears to do something different, to produce a temporary neurological event that has lasting effects. The analogy that researchers use is physical therapy versus a cast. Rather than holding a broken thing in place, psilocybin seems to enable a kind of active healing, making neural connections more flexible for a period and allowing the brain to reorganize itself around healthier patterns. Whether this framing is exactly right is still being determined, but the durability of the effects, lasting weeks or months from a single session, is unlike anything produced by conventional pharmacological approaches. The end-of-life anxiety trials added a particular moral dimension to the research. Studies at NYU and Johns Hopkins, published in 2016, enrolled patients with life-threatening cancer diagnoses who were experiencing anxiety and depression related to their illness. After 1 or 2 psilocybin sessions, participants reported dramatic reductions in death anxiety and significant improvements in quality of life. The effects persisted at 6-month follow-up. Participants described the experience consistently in terms of a fundamental shift in their relationship to dying, not an elimination of grief or fear, but an encounter with something larger than those feelings, a sense of perspective that made the approach of death more bearable. One participant described it as like being shown the room where death lives, and finding it wasn't what you thought it was. For the physicians running these trials, who had spent careers watching patients suffer in the final months of their lives, these results were difficult to sit with dispassionately. The question of what it meant ethically to have this data and not act on it was one they began asking in print. For most of the 20th century, the question of what psychedelics were actually doing to the brain had to remain largely theoretical, because the drugs were scheduled before brain imaging technology was sophisticated enough to look. Once the research resumed in the 2000s and brain scanners had improved to the point of being genuinely useful, scientists finally got to look inside. What they found was unexpected. Psychedelics, specifically psilocybin and LSD, dramatically reduce activity in a brain network called the default mode network, a set of interconnected regions associated with self-referential thought, rumination, and what neuroscientists sometimes call the narrative self, the internal monologue that tells you who you are, what you're worried about, and why everything is your fault. Under psilocybin, this network goes quiet. The brain's usually segregated regions begin communicating with each other in patterns never seen in ordinary consciousness. Mathematically, the result looks like what researchers describe as an increase in neural entropy, more information, more connections, more disorder. For patients trapped in rigid loops of depression or anxiety, this temporary dissolution of self may be exactly the thing that allows something new to form. The default mode network was only formally identified as a distinct brain system in the early 2000s, which means it was discovered at roughly the same time that researchers began scanning people's brains under psychedelics. This coincidence of timing turned out to be enormously productive. The DMN is a set of regions that become active when we are not engaged in focused external tasks, when we are daydreaming, remembering the past, imagining the future, thinking about other people's perspectives, or doing what humans do more than almost anything else, thinking about themselves. It is the network of the wandering mind. It is also, in its overactivated states, the network of depression, anxiety, obsessive rumination, and addiction, conditions characterized by thought patterns that circle back to the same material again and again without resolution. When Robin Carhart Harris and his colleagues at Imperial College first published brain imaging data from psilocybin sessions in 2012, the finding that attracted the most attention was not the increase in cross-network communication, but the specific suppression of DMN activity and its correlation with the intensity of the reported experience. The more the DMN quieted, the more pronounced the sense of ego dissolution, the temporary loss of the ordinary sense of being a separate, bounded self. This was a finding with significant theoretical implications. The self, or at least the neural substrate of the ordinary experience of being a self, turned out to be an active construction, something the brain was doing continuously, using energy and resources in a specific network of regions. And it could be switched off, temporarily, safely, predictably, with 1.5 grams of dried mushrooms. The implications for depression are worth dwelling on. Depression, in the neuroscientific framing, is in many ways a disorder of the default mode network, specifically a disorder of excessive and rigid self-referential processing. The depressed person is not simply sad. They're trapped in a particular mode of thinking about themselves, their past, their future, and their relationships, in which the same negative evaluations repeat without modification. The ruminative loop is self-reinforcing. The worse you feel, the more you think in the patterns that make you feel worse. Antidepressants, to varying degrees, modulate the emotional valence of this loop. They make it somewhat less painful to be inside it. Psilocybin, according to the imaging data, interrupts the loop itself by temporarily dismantling the network that produces it. What grows back, after the network reconstitutes itself over the days and weeks following a session, may be reorganized, less rigid, more plastic, more capable of forming new connections and new patterns. Patients in depression trials frequently describe the post-session period as a time of unusual mental flexibility, a sense that things that had seemed fixed and immovable were somehow more available for change. Therapists working in the clinical trials describe this as a window of enhanced neuroplasticity, a period during which the psychological work of integration can be more effective than it would otherwise be. Whether this is the right framework for understanding what is happening remains an active scientific debate. What is not in debate is that something is happening that conventional treatments are not producing, and that the brain imaging data is showing us for the first time where in the brain it's occurring. While psilocybin and MDMA were slowly making their way through clinical trials, another drug quietly walked through the regulatory front door. Ketamine, originally developed as an anesthetic in the 1960s and long associated with both surgical suites and, less helpfully, the harder end of the club scene, received FDA approval in 2019 in a modified nasal spray form called esketamine for treatment-resistant depression. It was not technically a classic psychedelic. Pharmacologically, it works quite differently, but it produces dissociative, profoundly altered states of consciousness, and it works in hours, not weeks, like conventional antidepressants. ketamine clinics began opening across the United States, offering infusions for depression, anxiety, and PTSD in settings that range from rigorously clinical to what could most charitably be described as spa-adjacent. It was the first legal, mainstream acknowledgement that something profoundly altered might be profoundly useful. Ketamine was synthesized in 1962 by Calvin Stevens, a professor at Wayne State University working under contract for Parke Davis Pharmaceutical. It was developed as a replacement for phencyclidine diaz, PCP, which was being used as a surgical anesthetic, but producing dangerous and prolonged psychotic episodes in patients recovering from surgery. Ketamine produced the desired anesthetic effect with a shorter and less catastrophic recovery profile, and was approved for human use in 1970. It became, and remains, one of the most widely used anesthetics in the world, particularly in pediatric and emergency settings. It is also on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines, and for about 30 years nobody in psychiatry paid it much attention. The recognition that ketamine had antidepressant properties came partly from accident and partly from clinical observation. Anesthesiologists noticed that patients with depression who received ketamine for surgical procedures sometimes reported improvements in mood that outlasted the anesthetic effect by days. Researchers studying ketamine's mechanism found that it worked through a completely different pathway than conventional antidepressants. Rather than modulating serotonin or dopamine, it acted on the glutamate system, the most abundant neurotransmitter in the brain, and appear to rapidly stimulate the growth of new synaptic connections. In depressed patients, these connections, literally the physical infrastructure of thought, were found to be reduced in density. Ketamine appeared to rebuild them quickly and measurably. The first controlled trials, published in the early 2000s, found that a single intravenous ketamine infusion produced significant antidepressant effects within hours in patients with treatment-resistant depression. This was pharmacologically unprecedented. Nothing in psychiatry had ever worked that fast. The ketamine clinic industry that emerged after the 2019 FDA approval was the first real-world test of what happens when an altered state treatment enters mainstream medicine without a robust regulatory framework for the therapeutic context. Unlike the clinical trials, which surrounded the drug with careful preparation, supervision, and integration support, most ketamine clinics offered infusions in medical settings with varying degrees of psychological support. Some had therapists on staff, some had a nurse and a recliner and a Spotify playlist. The range of quality was, by most accounts, substantial. Patients seeking treatment navigated a market that offered everything from genuinely therapeutic experiences to what amounted to a dissociative procedure with no clinical follow-through. The gap between what the research suggested was necessary and what the commercial market was providing became one of the organizing concerns of the psychedelic therapy field as it prepared for the eventual approval of psilocybin and MDMA. The ketamine story was, in this sense, both an opportunity and a warning. It demonstrated that altered state treatments could navigate the FDA pathway, enter mainstream medical practice, and develop a sustainable clinical market. It also demonstrated, with some urgency, that the therapeutic container, the preparation, the supervision, the integration, was not a luxury feature that could be stripped out to reduce costs without consequence. The drug alone was not the treatment. The drug plus the carefully held relationship was the treatment. Every indigenous practitioner who had ever worked with plant medicines could have told the ketamine clinic industry this. Some of them did. By the time MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, completed its Phase 3 trials of MDMA, assisted therapy for PTSD in the early 2020s, the data was unlike almost anything the psychiatric world had seen. In the trials, 67% of participants who received MDMA-assisted therapy no longer met diagnostic criteria for PTSD after treatment, compared to 32% in the placebo group. The participants were military veterans, first responders, and survivors of severe trauma, people for whom conventional therapy had provided limited relief for years. The FDA granted MDMA breakthrough therapy designation in 2017, fast-tracking the review process. The path to approval was not without complications. Questions about trial design and therapist conduct emerged in the public discussion, but the underlying data remained striking. A drug, once banned at raves, was on the verge of becoming a legal psychiatric treatment. MAPS was founded in 1986 by Rick Doblin, a Harvard public policy graduate who had witnessed the DEA scheduling of MDMA and decided, with what turned out to be extraordinary patience, to pursue its medical approval through the regulatory process rather than around it. This was a decision that required a particular kind of long-term thinking. In 1986, the FDA approval of a psychedelic compound for psychiatric use was not a near-term prospect. It was a 30-year project, minimum. Doblin began it anyway. He spent the following decades raising money, navigating regulatory requirements, managing a research organization on a non-profit budget, and maintaining productive relationships with the FDA, even when those relationships required what most people would describe as superhuman forbearance. He did not at any point predict that it would be easy. He appears to have been correct about this. PTSD presents a specific therapeutic challenge that maps onto MDMA's pharmacology with unusual precision. The condition is characterized by the intrusive re-experiencing of traumatic memories, flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance that the sufferer cannot process or integrate because the memories are accompanied by the same overwhelming emotional activation that made them traumatic in the first place. Conventional trauma therapy requires the patient to engage with the traumatic material while remaining sufficiently regulated to process it. For many patients with severe PTSD, this balance is simply not achievable. Every attempt to approach the memory triggers the same overwhelming response that made the memory impossible to process in the first place. The therapy stalls. The patient remains trapped. MDMA appears to dissolve this trap by simultaneously reducing the threat response activation of the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, and increasing the activity of the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for emotional regulation, perspective-taking, and the sense of being safe. Patients in MDMA sessions report being able to access traumatic memories with a quality of emotional presence and self-compassion that is, in their ordinary states, unavailable to them. They can look at what happened and feel, for perhaps the first time, that they are not destroyed by looking at it. This is not a suppression of the emotion. Multiple clinical reports describe sessions involving profound grief, fear, and cathartic release. But the quality of the experience is different, contained, navigable, survivable. Patients emerge from sessions having metabolized material that had been stuck for years or decades. The complications that emerge during the final approval process, allegations of boundary violations by therapists in clinical trials, questions about blinding methodology given MDMA's distinctive effects, concerns about the influence of MAPS as a non-profit funder on the research it was sponsoring were real, serious, and consequential. The FDA declined to approve MDMA-assisted therapy in 2024, requesting additional data. This was a setback that the field received with a mixture of disappointment and, among those who had been paying attention to the procedural concerns, a degree of grim recognition. The science had been compelling. The institutional execution had not been perfect. The distance between those two facts had just cost years. Doblin resigned from MAPS. The work continued. In November of 2020, the state of Oregon passed Measure 109, making it the first jurisdiction in the United States to legalize psilocybin for supervised adult use. Not for home use, not for purchase at a dispensary, but for use in licensed service centers with trained facilitators in a structured therapeutic context. It was, in many ways, exactly the framework that indigenous healers had been using for centuries: a carefully held container, a trained guide, an intentional setting. The difference was that Oregon's system came with a 2-year regulatory development period, a licensing board, and a great deal of debate about whether a $150 an hour psilocybin session was accessible to the populations who might need it most, or primarily to the populations who could most afford it. Colorado followed in 2022. The regulatory era of psychedelics had begun, and it arrived with a lot of paperwork. Measure 109 passed by a margin of 55 to 45%, a comfortable majority for a ballot measure asking voters to legalize a drug that had been federally classified as among the most dangerous for 50 years. The campaign was run on a platform of mental health access, framing psilocybin not as a recreational substance, but as a therapeutic tool for Oregonians suffering from depression, anxiety, addiction, and PTSD. The framing was deliberate and effective. Oregon had, in 2020, one of the highest rates of mental illness and one of the lowest rates of access to mental health treatment of any state in the country. The argument that people deserved access to a treatment with the clinical evidence psilocybin had accumulated was, in that context, difficult to oppose without looking either callous or uninformed. The 2 years between passage and implementation were occupied by an Oregon Psilocybin Services Advisory Board working to develop the regulations that would govern the new system. This process involved thousands of public comments, extensive expert testimony, and negotiations between constituencies with significantly different visions of what the system should look like. Mental health advocates pushed for clinical integration and robust training requirements for facilitators. Indigenous representatives raised concerns about cultural appropriation and the commercialization of practices rooted in their traditions. Business interests advocated for market structures that would allow the industry to scale. The resulting regulations reflected these tensions in their complexity, thorough, carefully considered, and immediately generating complaints from stakeholders on every side of the debate. The service centres that opened in 2023 were, for the most part, not the luxury wellness experiences that media coverage had suggested they would be. They were typically calm and carefully designed rooms in converted commercial spaces, staffed by facilitators who had completed a substantial training program and supervised their first clients with a combination of professional preparation and the specific kind of alertness that comes from doing something genuinely new. The clients who showed up in the first months were a cross-section that surprised some observers, not primarily affluent tech workers, but a significant proportion of people in genuine psychological distress who had heard the research or heard about someone else's experience and shown up with a particular hope that belongs to people who have tried many other things. The equity problem did not resolve itself. A full psilocybin experience, typically involving a preparation session, the service session itself, and an integration session, cost several $100s out of pocket, with no insurance coverage. For Oregonians living below the poverty line, this was not accessible. The Oregon Health Authority acknowledged the gap and explored sliding scale and scholarship frameworks. The communities that bore the highest burden of the mental health crisis that had partly motivated the ballot measure were, in many cases, the communities least able to access the treatment. This was not unique to Oregon's psilocybin program. It was a version of the same structural problem that afflicts American healthcare broadly. It was also for the advocates who had worked for decades on psychedelic access, a particular kind of disappointment that the breakthrough had arrived and its benefits were still not evenly distributed. While Oregon and Colorado moved towards state-level regulated frameworks, a quieter revolution was happening at the city and county level across the United States. Beginning with Denver in 2019, where voters approved a measure decriminalizing psilocybin mushrooms by the narrowest of margins, a wave of city-level decriminalization efforts swept through Oakland, Santa Cruz, Ann Arbor, Washington, D.C., Seattle, Detroit, and dozens of other municipalities. These measures didn't legalize anything. They simply instructed local law enforcement to treat personal possession of psychedelic plants and fungi as the lowest possible priority. The practical result was a patchwork map of American drug policy that had become genuinely difficult to navigate. In one city you could carry mushrooms with minimal risk, drive an hour in any direction, and the laws could be completely different. It was less a coherent policy shift and more a very large experiment in municipal democracy. The Denver Initiative, Initiative 301, passed in May of 2019 by a margin of less than 2 percentage points, 50.6% in favour. It was so close that organisers watched election results in real time, the count swinging back and forth for hours before the final margin became clear. The initiative had been organised by a campaign called Decriminalize Denver, run on a grassroots budget by advocates who had, for the most part, never run a ballot campaign before. They knocked on doors, ran informational sessions, and made the case that psilocybin mushrooms, specifically those containing psilocybin, used by adult Denver residents for personal purposes, were causing less harm than the criminal consequences of their possession. The city's law enforcement establishment opposed the measure. It passed anyway, and the conversation moved to Oakland within weeks. Oakland City Council passed a decriminalization resolution in June of 2019, weeks after Denver's vote, and went considerably further, decriminalizing not just psilocybin, but all entheogenic plants and fungi, including ayahuasca ingredients peyote and ibogaine. The resolution defined these substances as among the lowest law enforcement priority and directed city resources away from their prosecution. This was notable not only for its scope but for its explicit framing. The resolution named the history of colonial suppression of indigenous plant medicine practices and described decriminalization as a matter of cultural rights as well as public health. For a city council resolution about drug policy, it was an unusually historically literate document. The patchwork that resulted was, from a practical standpoint, genuinely confusing. Federal law had not changed. Psilocybin mushrooms remained Schedule I substances nationally, meaning that even in cities where local enforcement had been directed away from possession cases, federal prosecution remained theoretically possible, and the production, sale, and distribution of psilocybin remained illegal under any jurisdiction that had not specifically regulated it. Someone growing mushrooms in Ann Arbor in 2022 was in a different legal situation than someone doing the same thing in a Detroit suburb 20 miles away. Someone carrying mushrooms in Washington, D.C., which had decriminalized via a ballot initiative in 2020, was in a different situation from someone carrying them in Maryland, which surrounded D.C. on 3 sides. The map was a checkerboard of inconsistent enforcement priorities that provided comfort in some places and absolutely no protection in others. What the decriminalization wave did accomplish, beyond its direct effects on enforcement, was a shift in the public conversation. Every successful ballot measure or city council vote generated news coverage, which generated public awareness, which made the follow-on initiatives marginally easier to organise. The political logic was cumulative. Each city that decriminalised made it easier for the next city to do the same, and each city that did it without the predicted social chaos. No wave of mushroom-induced public disorder, no emergency rooms overwhelmed by psychedelic emergencies, provided evidence that the sky had not fallen. Public opinion on psychedelic decriminalization moved faster between 2019 and 2023 than it had in the previous 50 years. The patchwork was messy and legally incoherent. It was also in the American democratic tradition of change from the ground up, exactly how things move. Somewhere around 2015, a pattern began emerging from the technology industry in San Francisco. Engineers, product managers, and founders were taking 1/10 of a psychedelic dose too little to produce any perceptible hallucination every 3 days, and reporting improvements in focus, creativity, emotional regulation, and general quality of life. They called it microdosing. They talked about it at conferences. They wrote about it on forums. They recommended specific protocols with the same confident energy, usually reserved for standing desks and cold plunge routines. Journalist Ayelet Waldman wrote a memoir about it. James Fadiman, a psychologist who'd been studying psychedelics since the 1960s, became the unofficial academic home for microdosing data, collecting self-reports from thousands of people worldwide. The scientific evidence remained at best preliminary. Most rigorous studies found effects close to placebo. But Silicon Valley, a culture not always deterred by inconclusive data, had fully adopted the practice. Psilocybin had arrived in the quarterly planning meeting. The appeal of microdosing to the technology sector was in retrospect entirely legible. Silicon Valley operates on a cultural logic that prizes optimization, the idea that any system, including a human being, can be improved through the right combination of inputs. The quantified self movement, which encouraged people to track sleep, nutrition, exercise, heart rate variability, and dozens of other physiological metrics, had already established the idea that one's own biology was a problem to be solved. Microdosing fits seamlessly into this framework. It was an input that allegedly produced measurable improvements in output. The fact that the mechanism was not well understood and the evidence was largely anecdotal was, within a culture that had also enthusiastically adopted bulletproof coffee, intermittent fasting, and ice baths on limited scientific evidence, not a decisive obstacle. James Fadiman's work provided the framework that the early microdosing community organized around. His protocol, 0.1 grams of psilocybin every 3 days, allowing 2 days off between doses, had been developed through the kind of informal self-experimentation that Shulgin would have recognized. Fadiman collected thousands of self-report forms from people following the protocol and published his analysis, finding consistent themes: improved mood, better focus, reduced anxiety, increased empathy, enhanced creativity. These were self-reports without placebo control, from a self-selected population with a prior belief that microdosing would help them. The scientific value of this data was limited, but the consistency of the reports across a large and geographically diverse sample was not nothing, and Fadiman's presentation of it as a systematic rather than anecdotal body of observation helped give the practice a patina of rigour. The controlled studies that eventually arrived in the early 2020s were considerably less enthusiastic. A double-blind, placebo-controlled trial from Imperial College, published in 2021, found that microdosing psilocybin produced subjective improvements in well-being in participants, but so did the placebo. When participants didn't know whether they had received psilocybin or an inactive capsule, the effects were essentially indistinguishable. A study published in Nature in 2022 found similar results. Participants who believed they were microdosing reported benefits regardless of whether they were actually receiving the drug. The expectation effect, the well-documented tendency for people to feel better when they believe they are taking a treatment, appeared to account for a substantial portion of the reported benefits. This was not, it should be noted, the end of the story. Expectation effects are real and clinically meaningful, even if they're not pharmacological. A placebo that reliably makes people feel more focused, more creative, and more emotionally regulated is not worthless. It's just not primarily a drug effect. And the microdosing community, faced with the controlled trial results, largely continued microdosing because whatever was happening when they did it, the experience of it was positive enough to sustain. The practice is now estimated to be followed by millions of people worldwide, operating in a legal grey area that is explicitly illegal in most jurisdictions, and only very weakly enforced in a few. It is, depending on your perspective, a fascinating case study in the gap between scientific evidence and human behaviour, or simply a lot of people who found something that helped them and were not particularly concerned about the mechanism. As psychedelics moved into mainstream cultural conversation in the late 2010s, an entire industry materialized around the demand for guided experiences, ranging from the genuinely traditional to the genuinely expensive. In the Netherlands, where psilocybin truffles occupied a legal grey area, psychedelic retreat centres began operating openly, attracting clients from across Europe and the United States. In Costa Rica, Jamaica, and Mexico, where various psychedelics were either unscheduled or not actively enforced, retreat centres proliferated, some operating with rigorous training standards and legitimate clinical integration support, others essentially offering a mushroom trip in a nice garden for several $1,000s. By the early 2020s, a high-end psilocybin retreat could cost upward of $5,000 for a single weekend. The same medicine that indigenous communities had preserved through centuries of colonial suppression was being offered at a price point that made a business-class flight look casual. The Netherlands loophole is worth understanding because it created the infrastructure for much of the European retreat industry. While psilocybin mushrooms were banned in the Netherlands in 2008, following a high-profile death involving a tourist, the mycelium, the mushroom's fungal body, technically distinct from the fruiting mushroom, remained unscheduled. Psilocybin truffles, which are the sclerotia, or hardened underground storage masses of certain mushroom species, were thus technically legal to sell. This legislative gap, possibly inadvertent, sustained a legal truffle market in the Netherlands and provided a framework for psychedelic retreat centres to operate openly. By the early 2020s, centres like Synthesis and Silo Wellness were offering structured retreat programs with clinical preparation, supervision by trained facilitators, and integration support, attracting clients willing to pay several €1,000s for the experience. Jamaica emerged as another major hub, partly because psilocybin mushrooms are not scheduled under Jamaican law, and partly because entrepreneurs recognized early that the island's infrastructure for luxury tourism translated readily to the retreat model. Myco-Meditations, one of the first and most established Jamaican retreat operations, began offering structured psilocybin retreats in the mid-2010s with a medical intake process, trained facilitators, and genuine integration programming. The experience of attending was for many clients genuinely therapeutic. It was also, for most, only accessible to people with the financial resources to fly internationally, pay for lodging, and spend several $1,000s on the retreat itself. The populations bearing the highest burden of the mental health conditions for which psilocybin showed the most promise were, by and large, not the populations buying flights to Jamaica. The quality control problem was significant and not well addressed by the market alone. The term trained facilitator covered an enormous range of preparation, from people who had completed year-long training programs at established institutions with rigorous standards and supervised clinical hours, to people who had attended a weekend workshop and were now charging substantial sums to sit with strangers in psychedelic states. Without a licensing framework, there was no mechanism for consumers to distinguish between these profiles from the outside. People seeking legitimate therapeutic support sometimes found it. Others found something considerably less structured, less safe, and less therapeutically grounded than what the marketing materials had suggested. Serious adverse events, psychological crises that required emergency intervention, occurred more frequently in poorly supported retreat settings than in rigorously designed clinical contexts, a fact that confirmed what the research literature had been saying about the necessity of proper preparation and trained support. The retreat industry is not, in this assessment, uniformly problematic. Many of the centres operating in legal jurisdictions developed genuine expertise, built legitimate training programs, and provided real therapeutic value to clients who had no other legal access to psilocybin-assisted work. The best of them operated with a degree of clinical rigour that rivaled the formal trial settings. But the spread between best and worst was wide, the consumer's ability to evaluate that spread was limited, and the financial incentives in a growing market pointed consistently toward volume rather than quality. It was a problem that the emerging regulatory frameworks in Oregon and Colorado would need to address, and which would test whether the legal systems being built could actually accomplish what the clinical evidence had demonstrated was possible. One of the most unexpected political developments in the psychedelic renaissance was the emergence of military veterans as some of the most vocal advocates for psychedelic-assisted therapy. Groups like MAPS, Veterans for Natural Rights, and Heroic Hearts Project began sending veterans, many of them struggling with treatment-resistant PTSD after multiple combat deployments, to legal psychedelic retreats in Central America, and the results were, in many cases, dramatic. Veterans who had cycled through years of conventional psychiatric treatment reported that a single well-supported psilocybin or ayahuasca experience had changed their relationship to their trauma in ways that nothing prior had. Conservative politicians who might have been expected to oppose psychedelic reform found themselves listening differently when the person asking for access was a decorated combat veteran. The politics of psychedelics were shifting, and they were shifting from unexpected directions. The veteran PTSD crisis is, by any accounting, a public health emergency that the existing system has not adequately addressed. Estimates vary, but between 11 and 20% of veterans who served in Iraq and Afghanistan are affected by PTSD in any given year. The VA's treatment protocols, primarily evidence-based psychotherapies like prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy, often combined with medication management, work for some patients and fail others. The suicide rate among veterans remains approximately 1.5 times higher than the civilian population. Every year, the Veterans Crisis Line receives hundreds of thousands of calls. The clinical trials showing psilocybin and MDMA-assisted therapy producing PTSD remission rates significantly higher than standard care were not, for the veterans reading them, abstract research findings. They were the difference between a life and a death. Organisations like Heroic Hearts Project, founded by Army Ranger veteran Jesse Gould, formalised the process of connecting veterans with legal psychedelic retreat experiences in Jamaica, Peru, and other jurisdictions where the substances were accessible. The retreat model had obvious limitations, costs, travel, the absence of insurance coverage, but for veterans who had the means or the fundraising support to attend, the results reported were striking enough to sustain and expand the programs. Gould's own experience was representative. Years of treatment-resistant PTSD, a retreat with ayahuasca, and a fundamental shift in his relationship to his combat history that he described as the most therapeutically significant thing that had happened to him. He came home and started an organisation. The political valence of veteran advocacy for psychedelic access was something that movement strategists had noted and, with varying degrees of acknowledged deliberatism, incorporated into their communications approach. The veteran, in American political culture, carries a moral authority that is difficult to dismiss. A former Army Ranger advocating for psilocybin access does not occupy the same political space as a counterculture activist advocating for the same thing. Republican legislators from states with large veteran populations found themselves hearing from constituents, people with combat service records, with Purple Hearts, with the kind of patriotic credentials that a politician cannot easily dismiss, who are asking directly for access to a treatment that the federal government classified as having no medical value. The dissonance was productive. Bipartisan co-sponsorship of psychedelic research legislation became, by the early 2020s, significantly more common than it had been in the years prior. The political realignment was not complete, but it was real, and it was being driven in part by people who had not been the expected face of psychedelic advocacy. The Veterans Affairs system itself has moved cautiously but measurably toward engagement with the research. In 2023, Congress passed legislation explicitly allowing VA researchers to study psilocybin and MDMA in clinical trials, a significant change from the previous position, which had effectively prohibited VA-affiliated researchers from working with scheduled substances. The studies are early, the results will take years, but the fact that the VA, one of the largest and most bureaucratically conservative healthcare systems in the country, is now conducting clinical trials with psilocybin is a marker of how dramatically the institutional landscape has changed since Roland Griffiths received his first approval in 2000. By the early 2020s, venture capital had fully discovered psychedelics, and the results were predictably complicated. Dozens of psychedelic pharmaceutical companies went public on the stock markets of Canada and Australia, jurisdictions with lighter regulatory requirements. Atai Life Sciences, backed by German billionaire Christian Angermayer, raised hundreds of millions of dollars. Compass Pathways, focused on psilocybin for depression, went public on NASDAQ. Field Trip Health began opening ketamine clinics across North America with plans to expand into psilocybin the moment regulations allowed. And then came the patents. Companies began filing intellectual property claims on molecules that had been in use by indigenous communities for centuries, specific formulations of psilocybin, novel delivery methods, particular therapeutic protocols. Advocates who had spent decades pushing for psychedelic access were suddenly watching private companies attempt to own parts of it. The same counterculture that had once declared that psychedelics should belong to everyone was watching them get incorporated. The patent situation became a flashpoint in the psychedelic field with unusual speed, in part because the intellectual property strategies being deployed were visible, and in part because they directly threatened the access model that most advocates had been working toward. Compass Pathways, which had received a patent on a specific synthesized form of psilocybin, was criticized by researchers and advocates for filing broad patent claims that could, in their interpretation, restrict other companies' ability to develop psilocybin-based treatments. The company disputed this characterization. The dispute itself, technical, legal, and conducted partly in academic papers and partly in press releases, illustrated the degree to which the field had moved from a research conversation to a commercial one within a very short period. The drug development economics underlying the patent race were not entirely irrational from a business perspective. Developing a drug through the FDA approval process costs hundreds of millions of dollars and takes over a decade. Companies investing that capital need intellectual property protection to justify the investment. Without the ability to patent something, the argument goes, there is no incentive for private capital to fund the development work. This is the logic that drives pharmaceutical development broadly, and has produced, among other things, many important medicines that would not exist without private investment. It is also the logic that has produced an American pharmaceutical market with prices dramatically higher than any other developed country. Whether the same model is appropriate for molecules that have been in continuous human use for thousands of years, were documented in the scientific literature in the 1950s, and were rediscovered through research funded largely by private philanthropies rather than corporate R&D, is a question with no easy answer. The response from advocates was multi-directional. The Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies published psilocybin synthesis routes in open-access formats explicitly to prevent patenting. The Usona Institute, a non-profit working on psilocybin research, committed to an open-access model for its clinical data. Legal scholars began writing about the concept of patent busting through prior art claims, the argument that molecules and methods documented in public scientific literature before a patent filing date cannot be patented by a subsequent filer. A community of psychedelic patent attorneys emerged doing work that would have been unimaginable to describe 5 years earlier, and indigenous rights advocates continued making the broader argument that the entire framework of intellectual property, as applied to plant medicines whose cultural ownership long predated the relevant legal categories, was a form of appropriation that no number of patent challenges could fully address. The stock market, for its part, behaved exactly as stock markets do with emerging industries. Initial enthusiasm, significant volatility, and a shakeout. Many of the psychedelic companies that had listed on Canadian exchanges between 2020 and 2022 at high valuations had seen their share prices decline substantially by 2023. As the timeline to regulatory approval stretched, the costs of running clinical trials materialized, and investors who had arrived expecting quick returns recalibrated their expectations. The companies that survived were those with robust clinical programs, disciplined capital, management, and realistic timelines. The companies that had ridden the wave of cultural enthusiasm without the substance of genuine research programs found, as such companies generally do, that enthusiasm is not a sustainable business model. As the Western world rediscovered ayahuasca and psilocybin with the wide-eyed enthusiasm of someone who has just found a box of records at an estate sale, the indigenous communities who had never stopped using these medicines faced a more complicated reality. In the Peruvian Amazon, the booming ayahuasca tourism industry brought economic opportunity to some communities and devastating disruption to others. The demand for authentic indigenous ceremonies created a market that attracted both genuine traditional healers and opportunists with no training and considerable confidence. Sacred plants were being harvested faster than they could regenerate. Young people from indigenous communities were abandoning traditional apprenticeships, which took decades, for crash course retreats aimed at Western clients. Organizations like the Union of Indigenous Yage Medics of the Colombian Amazon began formally asserting intellectual property and cultural sovereignty over their own practices. The psychedelic renaissance, it turned out, had a colonialism problem. The Shipibo people of the Peruvian Amazon had been working with ayahuasca for generations before the first Westerner arrived in Iquitos asking about it. Their healing traditions were embedded in a cosmological framework that understood the plants not as pharmacological agents, but as living teachers with their own intelligence, each requiring specific relationships, protocols, and forms of respect. The healers, curanderos, or more specifically those working with ayahuasca, ayahuasqueros, trained for years or decades under the supervision of established practitioners, undergoing their own repeated ceremonies, dietary restrictions, and periods of isolation. The knowledge they accumulated was not separable from the cultural context in which it was embedded. The Icaros, the healing songs, could not simply be downloaded and applied. They were the product of a relationship between a specific healer, a specific tradition, and the plants themselves. The arrival of Western demand for ayahuasca ceremonies in Iquitos and the surrounding region created an economy that the traditional healing community was not equipped, and in many cases not inclined to manage on its own terms. Retreat centers proliferated. Healers who had spent decades in apprenticeship found themselves competing with people offering ayahuasca ceremonies after a weekend course. The economic pressure to perform more ceremonies more frequently disrupted the traditional protocols that governed when and how the ceremonies should be conducted. The plants that required careful tending and multi-year growth cycles were being harvested faster than the ecosystem could sustain them. The physical safety of Western participants who arrived in an unfamiliar environment, often without adequate health screening, sometimes in psychologically fragile states, was not consistently protected in the less rigorous operations. Deaths and serious adverse events occurred. Maria Sabina's fate is instructive. The Mazatec healer who guided R. Gordon Wasson in his 1955 experience, the one that became the Life magazine article that introduced psilocybin mushroom to the Western world, spent the remainder of her life in poverty, her village overrun by foreigners seeking mushroom ceremonies, her own people blaming her for the disruption that followed. She's now celebrated in the West as a foundational figure in the psychedelic renaissance. She died in 1980 in a burned house, by most accounts impoverished and deeply ambivalent about the legacy she had not chosen. The story does not resolve neatly. The formal assertion of intellectual and cultural sovereignty by indigenous organizations represents an attempt to address this history through legal and political means. The Colombian Amazon's traditional healers have argued for recognition of their medical knowledge as intellectual property under international frameworks, a position that sits in productive tension with the Western patent system's difficulty in recognizing communal, intergenerational oral knowledge as protectable IP. The conversation is ongoing and unresolved. What is clear is that the psychedelic renaissance cannot be understood as an unambiguous good for the communities whose knowledge and plants made it possible. Whether the field can build frameworks of genuine reciprocity, respect and material benefit that honour this debt is one of the defining ethical questions of the next decade. In 2018, journalist and author Michael Pollan, best known for writing about food, with the patient clarity of someone who genuinely believes you should know where your dinner comes from, published How to Change Your Mind, a rigorously reported, deeply personal exploration of the history, science and subjective experience of psychedelics. It became a #1 bestseller. It sat on the New York Times list for over a year. It was later adapted into a Netflix docuseries. The significance was not so much what it said. Much of the research had been published in journals for years. But who was saying it, and who was reading it? Pollan's readers were not, for the most part, the people who'd been following psychedelic research since the 90s. They were suburban professionals in their 40s and 50s, people who read The Omnivore's Dilemma and thought carefully about organic produce. People who are now reading about their first encounter with psilocybin in careful, measured prose and thinking, maybe this is for me. The cultural permission structure had shifted dramatically. Pollan's approach to the subject was characteristic of his best work. Skeptical, thorough, willing to follow the evidence wherever it led, and honest about his own discomfort with conclusions that conflicted with his prior assumptions. He was, by his own account, a person with no prior interest in psychedelics and significant prior skepticism about the claims made for them. The book traces his process of having that skepticism revised, not dissolved, but revised, by the science and by his own first-hand experiences, which he undertook with a combination of journalistic rigour and visible trepidation. The candour of this account was part of what made the book effective. He was not an evangelist, he was a reporter, reporting accurately on something that turned out to be more interesting and more credible than he had expected. The timing was significant. How to Change Your Mind arrived as the second wave of clinical research was producing its most compelling results. The Johns Hopkins Cancer Patient Study, the Imperial College Depression Trials, the preliminary MAPS, MDMA data, and as the decriminalization wave was just beginning to crest. It arrived in a cultural moment when mental health was being discussed more openly than at any prior point in American public life, when the limitations of existing treatments were being acknowledged more frankly, and when people who had spent decades dismissing psychedelics as relics of the counterculture were encountering, for the first time, a rigorous scientific case for their medical value. Pollan synthesized this case and delivered it in language that was accessible, honest, and free from both the defensive legalism of the clinical research world and the evangelical enthusiasm of the psychedelic advocacy community. It was, in this sense, exactly what the moment needed. The Netflix adaptation, which arrived in 2022 and dedicated individual episodes to LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, and mescaline, reached an audience even broader than the book. It featured extensive interviews with researchers, including Roland Griffiths, Robin Carhart-Harris, and Matthew Johnson, who were able to discuss their work in a format accessible to a general audience without losing scientific precision. It featured participants in clinical trials describing their experiences. It featured Pollan himself trying, on camera with characteristic self-consciousness, to describe what a psilocybin experience actually felt like from the inside. The series was watched by millions of people in the same months that Oregon's new psilocybin regulations were being debated, that MAPS was submitting its FDA application, and that state legislatures across the country were introducing psychedelic reform bills for the first time. The cultural and political conversations were happening simultaneously, feeding each other, and Pollan's work was a significant accelerant. The conversation it generated was not uniformly positive. Critics argued that Pollan's book, by centering a well-credentialed white male journalist's experience, inevitably framed psychedelics through a particular cultural lens that marginalized the indigenous and communities of color histories that had been there all along. Others worried that the mainstreaming effect would accelerate commercialization and accelerate the equity problems already visible in the retreat industry and the emerging regulatory frameworks. These were valid concerns. They were also concerns about the effects of a book that had genuinely moved the needle on public understanding of a treatment that, for many people, represented real hope. The critique and the value were both real, and holding them together was part of the more difficult work the field was being asked to do. As psychedelic-assisted therapy moved toward legalization and mainstream clinical adoption, a very practical question emerged that the field had somewhat glossed over in its excitement. Who was going to do this work, and how on earth were you going to train them? Being a psychedelic therapist requires a genuinely unusual combination of skills. You need clinical training, yes, but you also need the capacity to sit with someone in the middle of the most terrifying or transcendent experience of their life for 4 to 8 hours without projecting, without interfering, without your own unresolved psychological material blundering into the room. You need to know when to speak and when to be silent. You need to understand that a person weeping inconsolably might be fine, in fact might be having the most important experience of their life, and that your job is not to stop the weeping, but to ensure the person feels safe. Training programs proliferated rapidly in the early 2020s, some rigorous, some considerably less so, and the field began asking questions about scope of practice, ethical standards, and what to do when a therapist's own unexamined trauma showed up in a session at exactly the wrong moment. The specific challenge of psychedelic therapy training is that it requires something beyond clinical competence in the conventional sense. Standard psychotherapy training equips clinicians to manage sessions of 50 minutes in an outpatient office, to apply structured interventions to presenting problems, to maintain professional boundaries in a context where the power differential is clear and the session has a beginning and an end. Psychedelic therapy sessions last 4 to 8 hours. The client is in a profoundly altered state for much of that time. The material that surfaces can include childhood abuse, existential terror, ego dissolution, contact with what the client describes as spiritual presences, and waves of emotion that have no cognitive content, just feeling, enormous and undifferentiated, moving through the body. The therapist's role in this context is closer to that of a midwife or a skilled wilderness guide than to that of a conventional psychotherapist. You're not directing, you're accompanying. The training programs that emerged in the early 2020s varied enormously in depth, duration, and theoretical orientation. The California Institute of Integral Studies developed a graduate-level psychedelic-assisted therapy training program that ran over 9 months and included supervised practicums. The Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies developed training curricula for its clinical trial therapists that went through multiple revisions over a decade. Naropa University, Vital, Fluence, and dozens of other organizations offered programs ranging from months-long intensives to multi-day workshops. Oregon's new regulatory framework required facilitators to complete a state-approved training program and supervise practice hours, a genuine baseline, though one that some clinical professionals considered insufficient for the demands of the work. The ethics problem that became visible in the MDMA trial controversy of the early 2020s illuminated what happens when the training requirements are insufficient or the institutional oversight is weak. Reports of inappropriate physical contact between therapists and clients during MDMA sessions, taking advantage of the compound's effects on trust and emotional openness, raised fundamental questions about the specific vulnerabilities created by psychedelic therapy contexts. A client in the middle of an MDMA session may experience feelings of profound love, trust, and openness that make ordinary relational boundaries feel different than they do in ordinary consciousness. The responsibility this places on the therapist is enormous, and the failure modes are serious. The field's early instinct to staff sessions with 2 therapists, typically a male-female pair, to reduce the possibility of boundary violations was a structural safeguard. It was not, as the evidence demonstrated, sufficient in the absence of rigorous selection, training, supervision, and accountability mechanisms. The question of who is qualified to do this work has no clean answer yet. The clinical evidence suggests that the therapeutic container, the quality of the relationship between guide and participant, is one of the most significant determinants of outcome. Getting that relationship right is not purely a function of credentials. It is a function of personal development, of having done one's own work, of a quality of presence that training can cultivate but not manufacture. The field was building the plane while flying it, and the parts of the plane that most needed attention were the human ones, and so here you are, you made it. Through the cave paintings and the Aztec temples, through the Swiss chemistry lab and the CIA hotel room, through the San Francisco ballroom and the congressional hearing, and the Oregon licensing board meeting, through 10,000 years of human beings reaching for something beyond the ordinary, and occasionally finding it, and occasionally having a very bad time, and occasionally accidentally starting a revolution. Think about everything that had to happen to get us here. A Mazatec healer tending a tradition through 400 years of colonial suppression. A Swiss chemist cycling home on a Friday afternoon, convinced he was dying but actually fine. A Harvard professor who got fired and somehow made that the beginning of something rather than the end. A group of veterans who came home from war with wounds that nothing was touching, and found, in a quiet room with a trained guide and an ancient fungus, something that finally did. Think about the people who never got to benefit. The ones who sat in clinical trials in the 1960s, whose data was locked in a scheduling decision and never unlocked. The ones for whom the treatment existed, the evidence existed, and the access did not. Think about them as you fall asleep tonight in a world where the door, slowly and imperfectly, and with a great deal of remaining work to do, is opening again. The history of psychedelics is not a simple story. It is not a story of heroes and villains, of good science versus bad politics, of ancient wisdom versus modern ignorance, though it contains elements of all of those things. It is a story about what human beings do when they encounter something they cannot explain. They reach for it, they fear it, they try to control it, they lose it, and eventually they find their way back to it. We have done this with every important truth we have ever discovered. We have always been slow, and we have always eventually arrived. So tonight, as you pull the blanket up and let the day dissolve, maybe spare a thought for the Mazatec healer singing in a dark mountain village, for Albert Hoffman pedaling home through the streets of Basel with the universe rearranging itself around him, for the therapy patients in Baltimore and London and New York who sat with their fear and their grief and their decades of loss and found in the space that opened up something they had not expected to find, themselves, a little differently arranged, a little more bearable. They were all looking for the same thing in the end, the same thing you are looking for when you dim the lights and close your eyes and let the ordinary noise of the day fall away. Something true, something underneath all of it, something that was always there. Rest now. You've earned it. And somewhere, 10,000 years ago, on a rock wall in the Sahara, someone left a mark to say, I was here. I found something. I couldn't explain it, but I needed you to know. Good night.